Hello, everyone. I don't usually do this, but I actually have a blog, drakis79.tumblr.com. Yes, it's a Tumblr blog. I do history type stuff, comparing sort of what's going on today to stuff that happened in the past, and I try to predict where things are going. I don't really update it a lot, but one of the things I'm interested in is Strauss and Howe generational theory. And they're books that I read back in 2011. Generations came out in 1991, and The Fourth Turning, which was the sequel, came out in 1997. And I had been posting on the Fourth Turning forums for quite a few years after I had read the books. And some of my posts made it onto my blog, actually, in a post that I made a year and a half ago that was generally a critique of Strauss and Howe generational theory, which I'm pretty much going to summarize in this video. But I made that post in reaction to what I'd been seeing online, a trend actually of a lot of YouTube videos and news articles where people would mention these generations that I had read about in the books, particularly the millennial generation, which would come up a lot. And as the generation that's in their teens, 20s, and early 30s, it's a generation that gets a lot of criticism and sometimes praise. But what a lot of people don't know is that the term millennial generation was coined by Neil Howe and William Strauss in those two books, Generations and Fourth Turning. Generations was actually a very interesting study of generational patterns that have repeated themselves in American history. And the Fourth Turning attempted to solidify these patterns into a sort of predictive pattern. It was less academic than the first book and more of a bold attempt to turn history into a predictive science. It had a new agey sort of appeal that made it rather popular but turned off a lot of historians. They kind of saw it as a bunch of bunk. But truth be told, it wasn't such a major departure from their previous book and the concepts that were introduced in Generations, a book that was much better received among historians. Me personally, I don't think it's a bunch of bunk, and actually do think they were onto something with their generational theory. But that's not to say it was perfect. I have some issues with it and possible improvements. Is generational theory a predictive science, though? I don't think you can make that claim. I'm not sure the authors even have, though. It has a stronger leg to stand on than something like astrology, but I still would take the predictive claims of this theory with a grain of salt. Still, there are those who would swear by generational theory and see it as a predictive science as objectively reliable as any science. History as a social science has always interested me, but one always has to be careful when trying to apply hard scientific concepts to these softer sciences, especially when trying to make predictions based on them, which is exactly what the Fourth Turning tries to do. Before I go into my critique, I suppose I should provide some background. According to Strauss and Howe, history can be broken down into generational cycles. They call them saeculums in the Fourth Turning, but in Generations, the original 1991 book, they just call them cycles, which is what I'm going to call them. It's just easier to say. In Generations, they identify 5 cycles, and each cycle is broken up into 4 turnings. They actually do go a little bit further back and identify 2 additional cycles in the Fourth Turning, but they don't go into nearly as much detail on those cycles. The first turning is referred to as a high, although when we discussed this on the Fourth Turning forums before they shut it down at the beginning of the year, some people refer to this as a recovery rather than a high, because a lot of times you were recovering from a disastrous war, and there was a lot of devastation. So recovery is actually oftentimes a more appropriate word than a high. But the authors just refer to it as a high, so that's what we'll call it. The second turning is called an awakening. The third turning is called an unraveling, and the fourth turning is called a crisis. The parallels to the 4 seasons, spring, summer, autumn, and winter, are no coincidence. These seasons correlate with the seasons of a human's life. Spring represents childhood, summer represents youth, autumn represents midlife, and winter represents old age. And each cycle lasts generally 70 to 110 years or so, sort of matching up with the length of a long human lifespan. Although, as you can see here, this cycle is 67 years and this cycle is 112 years, so they can vary a little bit. There's not really a set length of time, so you never really know how long a cycle is going to be. And also, each turning is determined by the birth dates of a generational cohort group. So as you see here, each of these is the name of a generation. The first one is the Arthurian generation, which was born between the years 1433 and 1460. The Humanist generation was born between 1461 and 1482. And these are the actual turnings that occurred during those periods. Now, these two cycles, these first two here, the late medieval cycle and the Reformation cycle, are the ones I talked about earlier that were only briefly discussed in the fourth turning. It's really these 5 cycles that were really explored in depth in 1991's Generations. Generations is really the book that really explored the history of these cycles. The fourth turning talked more about the theory, the generational theory, and focused more on the millennial cycle and actually predicting the future. Generation did a little bit of predicting, but it was more about talking about the theory and exploring the history of these 5 cycles. One of the critiques I actually have of generational theory is that it has such a small sample size. It's really hard to identify a predictive pattern when your sample size is really just 5 cycles, and they sort of have 2 here, but they, like I said, they don't really go into too much depth. And you're probably wondering, why start here? Why start at the Arthurian generation? Well, actually, they didn't. In Generations, they started here. The first cycle was the New World cycle, beginning with the Puritan generation. And the reason was they wanted to study American history. And the first generation to come colonize America were the Puritans. That they were born in 1588 in England. So a lot of American society came from England. So when you're going back to the Puritan generation, you want to study their parents, you're studying the parliamentary generation who was their predecessors, and the Elizabethan generation before them. This was during the Armada crisis and intolerance and martyrdom, and their predecessors, the reprisal generation, who were born during the Protestant Reformation. And you keep going back to the Tudor Renaissance and the War of the Roses even before that, and the retreat from France before that. You go all the way back to the Arthurian generation. Going back further than that, it gets a little bit more difficult to find enough information, demographics and things like that they needed to really study the generations. But like I said, they never really did go into that much depth on these 2 generations, so it's really just these 5 that we have to go by. Strauss and Howe also identified 4 different types of generational personalities, or archetypes, that repeat themselves within these cycles. This is where it gets fun. These are the 4 generational archetypes. In Generations, they were called idealist, reactive, civic, and adaptive. But like I said, fourth turning was more new agey, so they gave them more fun, mystical type archetypal names like prophet, nomad, hero, artist. And yeah, it is more fun. So I'm going to refer to those names rather than the boring old idealist, reactive, civic, adaptive names. Just a disclaimer, and it is kind of annoying that I actually have to say this, but it is human nature for us to generalize and lump people into groups and then stereotype people based on their groups. I find myself doing it. Everyone does it, and it's just something we have to recognize when we do it. Just because someone has a characteristic, like when I say prophet is like this, nomad is like this, they can be narcissistic, but they can be brave. They can, Doesn't mean everyone is like that, obviously. It's describing a generalization of the generational personality. And you have to take this with a grain of salt. This isn't science, like I said in the beginning. This is just something that a couple historians wrote a book on. They were just trying to create a theory, and there's some truth to it, I think, but it's not something that you should base your whole worldview on. They also go out of their way to say that there are contrarians in every generation that go against the grain, are going to try to be different. So you're always going to run into exceptions. So in a way, this was genius of them, because this pretty much makes their theory foolproof. You can't disprove their theory now. Part of their rule is that there are exceptions. But they also kind of had to do it because they don't want you going around stereotyping people based on the year they were born. That should be discouraged, obviously. And that's what they're trying to do when they say that, and that's what this whole disclaimer is about. The whole point of this theory, I think, is just an alternative way to look at history. It's to break down history so that you're looking at it from a generational perspective, from the people's perspective, and not so much from the great man perspective. And it is a very interesting way of looking at history. All right, so here we go. The first is the prophet, or idealist, as they are referred to in generations. And this is straight out of their Life Course Associates website, so you could read this there. The prophet enters childhood during a high, enters adulthood during an awakening, enters midlife during an unraveling, and enters old age during a crisis. Prophet generations are born after a great war or other crisis, during a time of rejuvenated community life and consensus around a new societal order. Prophets grow up as the increasingly indulged children of this post-crisis era, coming of age as narcissistic young crusaders of a spiritual awakening, cultivate principle as moralistic midlifers, and emerge as wise elders guiding another historical crisis. By virtue of this location in history, such generations tend to be remembered for their coming-of-age passion and their principled elder stewardship. Their principal endowments are often in the domain of vision, values, and religion. Their best-known historical leaders include John Winthrop, William Berkeley, Samuel Adams, Benjamin Franklin, James Polk, Abraham Lincoln, Herbert Hoover, and Franklin Roosevelt. These were principled moralists, summoners of human sacrifice, and wagers of righteous wars. Early in life, few saw combat in uniform. Later in life, most came to be revered more for their inspiring words than for their grand deeds. Example among today's living generations, the baby boomers. Now, you have to remember, these books were written in the 90s to mostly baby boomer audiences, so they couldn't really be trashing the baby boomers when they were writing these books. I know a lot of people today, when they talk about the baby boomers, they don't really think of them as these righteous warriors guiding us nobly through the crisis with their wise words, but that's how they were written. In fact, the prophet generation is seen as the gray champions during a crisis. Like Benjamin Franklin was a gray champion during the Revolutionary War crisis. So was Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War crisis. Franklin Roosevelt was a gray champion during the World War II crisis. So what's Donald Trump? Is he our gray champion during this current crisis that we're in now? I'm sure there's some people that think so, but I'm sure there's way more people that think he's more of a villain. But who knows? He's just became our president. We don't know what's going to happen. But that's how they wrote it. That's how they depicted it. You know, I'm sure Neil Howe, he thought Clinton was going to win. That was his prediction. So maybe he thought Clinton was going to be our great champion. Who knows? But there's the great champion is supposed to be the generation, not just one person, representing the generational personality. And that's what these baby boomers eventually evolve into during the crisis. They're kind of these preachers. They're prophets. They're principled moralists. They're idealists. They're the Obi-Wan Kenobi, basically. The wise old man during the crisis era. But remember, a crisis has always got two sides, duking it out. And there's the winner and there's the loser. So it could be the Darth Vader. Who knows? The second is the nomad, or reactive as they're referred to in Generations. The nomad enters childhood during an awakening, enters adulthood during an unraveling, enters midlife during a crisis, and enters old age during a high. Nomad generations are born during a spiritual awakening, a time of social ideals and spiritual agendas when youth-fired attacks break out against the established institutional order. So what is an awakening? I guess I should probably talk about these turnings. I talked about the high already. That's kind of a recovery. I guess if you lost the war, we could call it recovery. If you won the war, it's a high. You're rebuilding the institutions and strengthening them. Or you're actually building a new institution, really. The awakening is the second turning. And this is when the institutions are actually coming under attack. It's more of a spiritual and cultural upheaval, though, than a institutional upheaval. Yeah, the institutions are under attack, but they're not being destroyed. They really don't get destroyed until the fourth turning, until the crisis. That's the death of the old order, the beginning of the new. Most of these awakenings have a religious context to them. The Protestant Reformation, the Puritan Awakening, the Great Awakening, the Transcendental Awakening. All these were religious movements. Missionary Awakening. Consciousness Revolution, when you think of the 60s, you don't really think of it as being religious. You think of hippies saying, it's the establishment, man, it has no soul. But there was definitely a religious element to the Consciousness Revolution. Think about the Beatles going to India to visit the Maharishi and all of the meditation retreats. There was a lot of Eastern influence, actually. But there was also the evangelical movement in the 70s. Just remember, it's always a cultural upheaval, a cultural and spiritual upheaval during a second turning, during an awakening. And the fourth turning is the institutional upheaval. The institutions are under attack during a second turning, and they continue to be under attack during the unraveling. That's when things are starting to fall apart, but they don't actually get destroyed. The institutions don't actually get destroyed until the crisis. That's the death of the old order and the birth of the new order. Okay, moving on. Nomads grow up as underprotected children during this awakening, come of age as alienated young adults in a post-awakening world, mellow into pragmatic midlife leaders during a historical crisis, and age into tough post-crisis elders. By virtue of this location in history, such generations tend to be remembered for their rising adult years of hell-raising and for their midlife years of hands-on, get-it-done leadership. Their principal endowments are often in the domain of liberty, survival, and honor. Their best-known historical leaders include Nathaniel Bacon, William Stoughton, George Washington, John Adams, Ulysses Grant, Grover Cleveland, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower. These have been cunning, hard-to-fool realists, taciturn warriors who prefer to meet problems and adversaries one-on-one. Example among today's living generations? Generation X. Now, when the book Generations came out in 1991, the term Generation X didn't exist yet. Neither did Millennial Generation. That term was actually coined in that book in Generations, 1991. Generation X, though, was referred to as the 13th generation at the time. It was actually a different author that coined the phrase Generation X in a separate book actually titled Generation X. But why do they call them the 13th generation? Well, if you start at the revolutionary cycle with the awakening generation and you count down from there, you'll see that the 13th generation actually is Generation X. But why start from the awakening generation? Well, I guess the argument is that they were the oldest generation, or the generation entering elderhood during the American Revolution, because they were the prophet generation. I guess you could argue that there were probably a few members of the Enlightenment generation kicking around, maybe a couple, and even in the Glorious generation. But according to the revolutionary cycle, it was really the awakening generation, the prophet that was entering elderhood. So really, they're the ones that really count. So yeah, Generation X is the 13th American, in air quotes, generation. Now, this happens to be my generation, believe it or not. I'm born at the tail end of this period here, 1979. So I'm actually a cusper, a Generation X millennial cusper. I'll talk more about cusps later. Nomad generations are often described as the unluckiest of the generational archetypes. And that's because of their position in the generational constellation. They're born during an awakening, and that's a period when adults are really focused on finding their inner spirituality. So they're often neglected and left to their own devices. This is why they're often described as underprotected in childhood. And they're often also almost always seen as bad kids. And I think it's largely the fault of the prior generation, the prophets, especially the later prophets. Prophets were increasingly indulged as they grew up, and they became spoiled. The later prophets especially, they became bratty kids. Think Dennis the Menace, who was like a baby boom kid. That was like a depiction of a bratty, kind of spoiled baby boom kid who was a troublemaker. Now, by the time the Generation X started being born in the 60s, kids weren't seen so much as cute anymore, like cute and spoiled, like Veruca Salt. Now, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, downright spoiled and in the 60s. And then you have devil babies like Rosemary's Baby, and in The Omen, you have Damien. Kids are just seen as bad kids. And if you want to go further back to the Lost Generation, you have Pinocchio. If you actually read the book Pinocchio, not the cartoon that was the Disney cartoon that was made in the 40s when the silent generation were still kids, made Pinocchio look cute and nice. If you actually read the children's book Pinocchio, Pinocchio is depicted as a pretty nasty kid who actually kills Jiminy Cricket by throwing him against the wall. They're depicted as bullies, and I'll be honest, I think there's probably a lot of truth to that. I think there is a lot of bullying among nomads when they're kids because there isn't a lot of supervision. They're also unlucky when they get older because when you think about it, they hit midlife during the crisis, and that's their peak earning years. And the fourth turning, which is the crisis, that's usually when there's a Great Depression or the economy takes a dive. So it's not good for the nomads. You could think of the nomads as kind of like the Han Solo if we're doing the Star Wars reference. We had Obi-Wan Kenobi was the prophet. Han Solo is kind of like the nomad. He's not quite as starry-eyed as the Luke Skywalker, who would be the next one, which is the hero. He's the jaded bad boy, kind of a risk taker, but he has a heart of gold. He's a little rough around the edges, but he has a good heart. The third archetype is the hero, or civic as they're referred to in generations. The hero enters childhood during an unraveling, enters adulthood during a crisis, enters midlife during a high, and enters old age during an awakening. Hero generations are born after a spiritual awakening, during a time of individual pragmatism, self-reliance, laissez-faire, and national or sectional or ethnic chauvinism. This is basically the unraveling period, considered like laissez-faire period when it's like the autumn period. Think of like a period when there's like a harvest. People are partying. It's kind of fun, but things are kind of coming to an end because the winter is coming. Heroes grow up as increasingly protected post-awakening children, come of age as the heroic young team workers of a historical crisis, demonstrate hubris as energetic midlifers, and emerge as powerful elders attacked by another awakening. Think of the 60s during the consciousness revolution. It's the establishment, man. Who was the establishment? They were the elders. Who were the elders? The GI generation, the previous hero generation. So that's what they mean by under attack during the awakening. It was the GI generation that was under attack, the previous hero generation. By virtue of this location in history, such generations tend to be remembered for their collective coming-of-age triumphs and their hubristic elder achievements. Their principal endowments are often in the domain of community, affluence, and technology. Their best-known historical leaders include Cotton Mather, King Carter, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, John Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan. These have been vigorous and rational institution builders. In midlife, all have been aggressive advocates of economic prosperity and public optimism, and all have maintained a reputation for civic energy and competence to the very ends of their lives. Examples among today's living generations, GIs and millennials. So yes, this is the soldier of the Crisis War, the Luke Skywalker, basically, the hero. But they could also be the villains, because think about it, the Nazis were also of the same generation as the GIs. They were fighting just on the other side of the war. The Crisis always has two sides to the conflict. One side has to lose. If you're on the losing side of the crisis and you're in the hero generation, chances are life is going to be pretty miserable for you. So maybe the nomads aren't the unluckiest generation. If you're on the losing side of the fourth turning and you're in the hero generation, you're probably more unlucky than someone in the nomad generation, especially if the nomad managed to avoid the Crisis War. I talk about the Crisis War a lot. Does the crisis have to have a war? Pretty much every crisis has had a war. The only possible exception was the New World cycle, which had the Glorious Revolution, which was a bloodless war for the most part. But there was King Philip's War, which was a Native American revolt in Massachusetts. And there was also the War of Spanish Succession, which was actually a total war that occurred in Europe. America wasn't really involved in it, and it occurred at the very end of this turning here. The turning actually doesn't end in 1700. It ends a few years after that, probably like 1703. The birth years are always a few years before the turning, beginning and end years. And I'll explain why later. There actually is a reason why these dates are so weird, why it's not just 1670 to 1700 or 1701 to 1720, why they're not just rounded off. There's actually a real reason why. But yeah, all of the total wars happened during crises, during fourth turnings. War of the Roses was a total war. Armada Crisis was a total war. War of Spanish Succession was a total war. American Revolution was a total war. Civil War was a total war. World War II was a total war. And who knows, maybe we'll get World War III during this fourth turning. So what do I mean by total war? I mean, usually when you say total war, you mean like a war that's unrestricted and all weapons are used, like all the laws are broken. Would World War I count? I mean, it seems like you would count a war like World War I where they were using mustard gas and stuff like that. But that happened during a third turning, not a fourth turning. I would count World War I as a total war. But I guess you could make the argument that World War I was kind of left unresolved, and it took World War II to really resolve all those issues. So World War II was the real total war. So if resolution is what you're looking for when you think of a total war, then World War II is the real total war. World War I just started it. Kind of like 9/11 is our World War I for this cycle. And 9/11 happened during a third turning because it happened in 2001, and the wars after that, like the war in Iraq and everything. And that was kind of like our World War One and everything. But it didn't resolve anything. It just sort of led to more wars in the Middle East, and now we're kind of stuck in this quagmire, and it's leading to bigger problems and bigger wars, and maybe that's what might lead us to like a World War III situation. Scary to think about, but most wars happen in fourth turnings and in third turnings. Sometimes in second turnings, but very rarely in first turnings, although a couple of them have. The two I can think of are the War of 1812 and the Korean War. I think those are the only two, but I could be wrong. It's been a while since I read the book. But yeah, I think the only fourth turning in which there wasn't a major war, well, at least in America, was the Glorious Revolution. But even then, there was King Philip's War and the War of Spanish Succession over in Europe. Oh, and there was the Salem witch trials, which wasn't really a war, but a lot of people died in that. So that's something. The fourth archetype is the artist, or adaptive as they are referred to in generations. The artist enters childhood during a crisis, enters adulthood during a high, enters midlife during an awakening, and enters old age during an unraveling. Artist generations are born during a great war or other historical crisis, a time when great worldly perils boil off the complexity of life and public consensus, aggressive institutions, and personal sacrifice prevail. Artists grow up overprotected by adults preoccupied with the crisis, come of age as the sensitive young adults of a post-crisis world, break free as indecisive midlife leaders during a spiritual awakening, and age into empathic post-awakening elders. By virtue of this location in history, such generations tend to be remembered for their quiet years of rising adulthood and their midlife years of flexible, consensus-building leadership. Their principal endowments are often in the domain of pluralism, expertise, and due process. Their best-known historical leaders include William Shirley, Cadwallader Colden, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson. These have been sensitive and complex social technicians, advocates of fair play, and the politics of inclusion. Examples among today's generations: the silent and homeland generations. The artist generation often gets overlooked because they are children during the crisis, so they usually play the smallest role during the biggest events in history. But they do play large roles during the second turnings, during the awakenings, and that's basically when they're reaching midlife, their most productive years. The Beatles, for instance, were artist generation. Monty Python, artist generation. Elvis Presley. I mean, when you think about it, in the 60s, they were basically the ones that invented rock and roll. They were a lot of the big movie stars in the 60s. Artist generation tends to be the most celebrated entertainers during the awakening period, which is when culture's blooming. So that's why they're known as artists. They're also known as compromisers in government. They're not really known for being great leaders in government. In fact, we've had no silent generation presidents. None. Yeah, of the silent generation, when you think about all the presidential candidates that ran, at least in recent years, I could think of Ron Paul. He ran twice, lost both times. Bernie Sanders ran this recent election. He lost. He might run again. Maybe we'll have one more chance in 20. He'll run again. How old is he going to be then, though? He's going to be 78. No, he's probably not going to run again. So yeah, I think we missed our chance to get a silent generation president. I don't think we're going to get one. Joe Biden, I don't think he's going to run. He's silent generation, I think. So yeah, I don't think I think we missed our chance. Because Reagan was GI generation, so was Jimmy Carter. And then we had George H.W. Bush, who was also GI generation. And then we went right from him to Bill Clinton, who was a baby boomer. So we went straight from GI to Clinton. So we had no silent generation presidents. We just skipped them. And then Obama was Generation X. And now we're right back to baby boom. So yeah, just skipped silent generation. I think we have had a few artist generation presidents in the past. John Quincy Adams was artist. He was from the compromise generation. Andrew Jackson too, compromise generation. Who else? Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, I think. So we've had a few. Not too many though. I'm probably missing a couple others. That's who I can think of off the top of my head though. Now, as far as the Star Wars analogy goes, let's see. We had Luke and I guess Leia, hero generation. We had Han Solo and Chewbacca, who were the nomads. We had Obi-Wan Kenobi and I guess Darth Vader were the prophet generation. But who's the artist? Who meets the artist archetype? There's no like children, no really old people. Because, I mean, when you're thinking of a fourth turning, that's who the artist generation are. They're the really young or the really old. But when you think about it, what role are they fulfilling during a fourth turning? What role are children and the very old fulfilling? They're not really important to affecting change, but they're still serving a role. They're still kind of important to the heart of society, which is kind of the role that the artist serves all throughout their lives, I think. So I think R2-D2 and C-3PO would be a good match for them. They're kind of the comic relief, but they're also the point of view characters too. They're the characters you can kind of relate to because you're kind of, when you think about it, the movie opens with them and you're kind of seeing things from their point of view and they kind of don't know what's going on and they're kind of innocent and, I mean, they're robots, but you can kind of relate to them and you kind of feel for them. And I think R2-D2 and C-3PO are good matches for the artist archetype. I think I'm going to end part 1 of my series here because this is getting pretty long. I haven't even gotten to my actual critique yet. This is really just an overview of the theory. But my actual personal critique is getting into the cusps and getting into the Civil War cycle because that's what I really want to talk about. The Civil War cycle, if you notice, has some problems here. You know, what's with this, you know, and that's what I want to talk about. But I also want to talk about the cusps because there's a problem going on with why the years are so weird and why the cycles change on a dime. I want to talk a little bit about that. That'll be in the next, it might be 2 more parts actually. So there's a lot to talk about. But I'm going to end it here because this video is getting long. And I hope you're entertained by this. I mean, or maybe you're learning something. It might be boring, but it might be informative, or it might be entertaining too. Anyway, I'll post the next video probably after Christmas because these take a long time to make. Next time, I will see you. Goodbye.